Hello everyone and welcome back to Red Room Stories. I know many of you tune into these tales to help you drift off to sleep. So before we settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. The quaint little town of Harrow's Creek was nestled among the whispering pines and rolling hills of northern Oregon, its charm rooted in cobbled streets and antique storefronts. But for all its picturesque beauty, an undercurrent of something, dark pulsed beneath the surface, barely noticeable yet ever-present. Speculation about the old Varnell mansion at the edge of town was common among residents, particularly since it had sat empty for nearly 3 decades, shrouded in mystery and rumors of the macabre. It was here that Evelyn Parks found herself. One early autumn evening, having taken a wrong turn while looking for inspiration for her next novel, the air was notably cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as twilight bled indigo across the sky. With a deep breath, Evelyn stepped forward, her boot crunching on gravel as she approached the wrought iron gate, its surface rusted and heavy with age. Intrigued and unnerved, she pushed the gate open with a creaking protest, as if the ground itself were warning her not to enter. The mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the dimming light, windows like hollow eyes peering into her very soul. There was an allure to the residence, a magnetic force pulling at her curiosity that swallowed her trepidation whole, and she crossed the threshold into the overgrown yard, the underbrush clawing at her jeans. Inside the mansion, stray beams of moonlight cut through the dust-laden air, illuminating scattered furniture draped in ghostly sheets. Shadows danced along the wallpaper, their movements erratic and peculiar, like whispers of anguish trapped in time. Each step Evelyn took stirred the slumbering silence, and she sensed a palpable heaviness pressing against her chest, as if the house itself were alive and resentful of her presence. When she stumbled upon a forgotten study, cluttered with yellowed papers, she felt an electric thrill hum under her skin. Here, reality blurred with the stories waiting to be unraveled, and she knew she had to document her findings. Yet, in her rush to explore this treasure trove, she noticed oddities that sent chills skittering along her spine. The journal entries she discovered were written in a frenzied scrawl, detailing visions of nightmare creatures that stalked the author's waking life. Names and dates crisscrossed the pages, notes about a waking hour and the harvest, plastered among sketches of grotesque shapes with too many eyes and jagged mouths. She felt the weight of those words, an echo of despair that seemed to seep from the ink. The hair on the back of her neck prickled with apprehension as she flipped through more entries, catching glimpses of madness that encroached on the mundane. Suddenly, the air shifted and she heard it, a faint echoing sound, like whispers carried by the wind through broken windows. They spiraled around her, curling into her ears, teasing thoughts of dread and dread to come. The sensation was treacherous, lush with anticipation, as if the house were inviting her to acknowledge a presence lurking just beyond the veil of sight. The journal slipped from her fingers, thudding against the floor, breaking her concentration. She shook her head, attributing the sound to nothing more than a trick of the mind. Yet unease curled tight in her abdomen. Drawn deeper into the mansion's bowels, she stumbled into a narrow corridor that felt heavier than the others, a weight of ancient sorrow hanging in the air. Each wall was lined with sepia-toned photographs of the Varnell family, their smiles unnaturally wide, eyes pinched with secrets too dark to share. She felt them watching, judging, and their gaze shifted in her periphery, always just out of sight. The corridor grew increasingly claustrophobic, echoes of laughter and sobs wafting down the hall, wrapping around her ankles like tendrils snaking up from a dark abyss. As she neared the end of the corridor, a door loomed at its terminus. The wood grained and splintered as if reluctant to yield to her touch. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn pushed it open, revealing a grand ballroom consumed by mold and decadence. The remnants of a chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, and the floor was littered with shards of broken glass that glittered like eyes. The air thickened, the temperature plunging as a sudden draft caressed her skin, bringing with it the scent of mildew and rot. In the center of the room, the remnants of a once splendid waltz echoed silently, the shadows weaving and twisting like dancers lost in a time loop. Evelyn's breath hitched as she caught movement in the far corner. A figure, faint and flickering, its features obscured by shifting shadow. Though she felt the urge to flee, her feet were rooted in place, mesmerized by the ethereal sight. As she strained to peer closer, the figure morphed into a grotesque parody of itself, its limbs stretching and contorting with impossible fluidity. Just as fear surged within her, the floorboards groaned ominously under her weight, and the laughter from beyond bubbled up, low, melodic, sinister. Panic exploded in her chest, igniting every nerve ending, and she turned to escape. But darkness pooled at her feet, rising like a siren's call, and she stumbled, falling into the depths of despair. The surreal warmth enveloped her, shrieking, whispering, the sensation merging with her consciousness. Evelyn fled through the maze of rooms, desperately retracing her steps as laughter turned to howls, the house itself shifting around her, living and breathing. She could almost hear the old Varnells pleading from beyond the veil, their cries for liberation melding with the cacophony of voices that grew louder every heartbeat. The front door appeared further away than she remembered, and her pulse raced, a frantic drumbeat resonating in the hollow spaces of the mansion. Finally reaching the grand staircase, Evelyn bypassed it altogether, launching herself through a window, shattering the glass with the ferocity of 1,000 nightmares. She fell into the bramble outside, scraping her skin on the splintering wood. Breaths came in ragged gasps as she collapsed on the grass, the moonlight now caressing her like a lover, sweet and treacherous. But she had escaped, or so she thought. As the cold night air washed over her, fresh terror ignited in her veins. Staring back at the mansion, she noticed something horrific. The silhouettes of figures now standing in the windows, their grotesque forms lined up as if to bid farewell or welcome her back, as if they had opened their arms wide, merging with the shadows to swallow her once more. Evelyn blinked hard, fighting tears that stung her eyes. She turned to run. As her feet pounded against the earth, the laughter of the Varnells enveloped her, a siren's call in the night, resonating deep within her core. Only now, she understood. The waking hour was eternal, and Harrow's Creek held her captive, finding solace in her fear. There was no escape, only the stifling certainty that she would never leave the mansion, not even in death. Her soul entwined with the darkness, forever spiraling into an abyss from which she could never return. In the heart of a city that never truly sleeps, where flickering streetlights cast long shadows over cracked pavement, a curious unease thrummed beneath the surface. It was in this labyrinthine urban sprawl that Amelia, a recent college graduate, burdened with crippling debt and fleeting ambition, found herself standing in front of the dilapidated Hawthorne Hotel. Abandoned for over a decade, it loomed like a forgotten giant, its shattered windows resembling hollow eyes gazing down at her, suffused with a mix of dread and nostalgia. This was a place where no one dared to linger after dark, where whispers of ghostly encounters collided with the clamor of city life. Yet the thrill of exploration tugged at her insatiable curiosity. Amelia pushed the heavy door, which creaked open like a throat unsealing a secret, and stepped into the dimly lit lobby. Dust particles danced in the faint shafts of light, and the air hung thick with the scent of mildew and decay. It was colder inside than it had been outside, a shiver creeping down her spine as if the building itself exhaled, releasing the breath of long-forgotten lives. The once grand chandelier, now reduced to a skeletal frame, dripped cobwebs like ghostly tendrils from the ceiling. She shivered, dismissing the sensation as mere imagination, as her feet carried her deeper into the murky depths of the hotel. As she wandered the hallways, her phone's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the peeling wallpaper. Stories of missing persons linked to the hawthorn swirled in her mind like autumn leaves caught in a tempest. She felt as though unseen eyes were watching her every move, yet the emptiness echoed only her breath and the soft crunch of her footsteps on the debris-strewn floor. A distant sound akin to a child's laughter floated to her ears, a chilling vibration that seemed to weave through the building's decay. Drawn toward the haunting melody, Amelia's heart raced, and she followed it into a small parlor room where remnants of forgotten elegance lay buried beneath layers of neglect. An ornate mirror, surprisingly intact, stood against the wall, reflecting a fractured version of herself, a young woman lost between her dreams and the oppressive reality of her choices. In that moment, the laughter crescendoed into an unsettling cacophony, echoing throughout the hollow corridors. She turned sharply, realizing with dread that it was not children's laughter at all. It was the sound of someone, or something, mimicking the innocence of youth, writhing in imitation amidst the rot. Unable to shake the feeling of being hunted, Amelia fled the parlor, her mind racing with questions and fears. She stumbled into the kitchen, where rusted pans lay strewn about as if the last meal had been abandoned mid-preparation. The overwhelming stench of rancid food hung heavy in the air, choking her senses. Just beyond the door, her phone buzzed violently, a frantic pulse in her pocket that momentarily broke the deluge of fear. It was a text from her brother, a practical voice from the outside world that warned her against lingering too long. But a sudden impulse urged her to stay, to uncover the dark whispers of the past. As she delved deeper into the hotel, Amelia began to stumble upon objects that didn't belong. A child's teddy bear perched on a chair, a set of crayons scattered. Across a dusty table, remnants of lives that felt disturbingly close. Each discovery felt prescient, as if the hotel was weaving a narrative around her, pulling strings that danced in the shadows. Time warped. Minutes felt like hours, and her sense of reality began to blur with the eerie atmosphere of the building. Her breaths came faster as she collapsed into a decaying drawing room, where the air buzzed with a static electricity that sent her skin crawling. It was then that she saw it, a figure at the edge of her vision, a fleeting silhouette darting just beyond the periphery of her sight. Heart pounding, Amelia stumbled to her feet, drawn instinctively toward the source of her dread. The hall stretched impossibly long, adorned with portraits that seemed to leer at her, their painted eyes following her every move. They grinned, wide mouths agape in silent screams that reverberated in her mind. Bleeding into her growing anxiety, the house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the walls breathing and contracting with each clandestine footfall. Turning a corner, she found herself in a small room adorned with childlike drawings scrawled haphazardly across the walls. Beneath, the vibrant colors of sunlit fields and smiling family portraits lay darker undercurrents, scribbles of distorted faces and shadowy hands reaching out, pleading. The laughter erupted again, louder now, and filtered through her consciousness like a poisonous fog. With every note echoing in her ears, visions of a desperate family began to fuse with her own memories. Images of long, forgotten summer campfires and soft lullabies whispered at bedtime, twisted now into a sinister mockery. Feeling a rising tide of panic, Amelia rushed toward the exit, reckless in her fear. She gripped the door handle, fingers trembling, when the laughter shifted into a sickening wail, twisting her heart into knots. Shadows coalesced behind her, swirling like the dark energy of the hotel come to life. The air grew heavy, each breath stinging her lungs as if filled with ash. When she finally turned back to confront the malevolent force, she was met with the visceral sight of the wall of the parlor room shifting, expanding, as a mouth formed where paint had once crowded as decor. The figure stepped from the wall, a grotesque amalgamation of lost souls, eyes wide with the absence of hope. Their presence enveloped her in a chill so deep that it pierced through her very bones, and it was then that Amelia understood. The Hawthorne Hotel was not just a tomb of memories. It was a snare, luring the desperate toward its insatiable hunger. The children's laughter transformed into pleading cries that stabbed at her heart, merging her identity with those who had been lost before her. At that moment, time seemed to reset, and an awful clarity washed over her. Amelia was not just an innocent explorer. She was one of them, trapped within an eternal loop of despair and longing. As the walls closed in around her, blurring the past and the present, her world shifted into a landscape devoid of time. The hotel had swallowed her whole, and the absurdity of everything came crashing down, a realization so profound it stole her breath. In the very essence of her being, she felt the tug of countless souls, their stories weaving into her flesh, altering her shape and mind. The laughter rang in her ears, layered now with cries of torment as the hotel reclaimed her. The surroundings twisted beyond recognition, doors spiraling endlessly into darkness, corridors folding into themselves. She was alone in a forgotten eternity, an echo in its grand design, forever part of the horror she once sought to escape. And then, the hotel was silent once more, settling back into its slumber as the city outside continued its indifferent march forward. Amelia's voice lingered within the walls, a fleeting whisper among the shadows, as new adventurers would stumble upon the same worn door and feel the same chill coil around their spines. The cycle would continue, feeding the insatiable hunger of the Hawthorne Hotel, forever cloaked in its haunting laughter, waiting for the next to succumb to its embrace. In the hushed expanse of the abandoned town of Eldridge, nestled deep within the cracked mountains of Idaho, a sense of unease clung to the air like the damp mist that shrouded its dilapidated buildings. Iris Hart had come seeking solace, a chance to escape the relentless pressures of her urban life as a nurse grappling with loss and guilt. The isolation was supposed to be healing, a retreat to stitch together the frayed edges of her heart. Instead, it felt like a trap. As the thick fog rolled through the streets, muffling sounds and distorting her sense of direction, each step on the rain-slicked cobblestones echoed like a whisper of the past, teasing her with the promise of memories forgotten. The last flicker of daylight danced behind the jagged peaks as Iris made her way toward the decaying library, a once grand structure that had surrendered itself to rot. Its windows, dark and empty, loomed like eyes watching her approach. There was an odd familiarity about it, as if the whole town had conspired to draw her here, a moth to an ancient flame. An inexplicable urge compelled her to step inside, despite a growing knot of apprehension tightening around her stomach. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew, and dust shifted like spirits in the air as she moved through the darkness. Each page she turned in the brittle, yellowed books felt like turning the gears of history. A chilling sensation brushed against her fingertips, suggesting remnants of thoughts not quite her own. She unearthed tales of Eldridge, a town cursed by sorrow, abandoned after a series of inexplicable disappearances decades ago. The townsfolk had whispered of a force in the forest that surrounded them, a hunger insatiable, and after reading, she felt its presence now. It pulled at the edges of her consciousness, beckoning her deeper into its mystery, feeding her need to uncover truth amidst chaos. The sun faded, and as the shadows deepened, so too did the town's silence, thickening to a palpable weight. The spectral whispers of the library transformed into a chorus of disembodied voices just beyond her hearing, calling her name, coaxing her out into the fog. Heart racing, the looming dread grew more pronounced, invading the recesses of her mind, with the persistent rhythm of soft thuds like footsteps trailing just behind her. Yet when she turned, there was nothing but the oppressive quiet pressing in around her. Determined to unravel the mystery, Iris ventured further, her resolve propelled by the shadows wrapping around her like a second skin. In an alley, she discovered a weathered journal, its pages filled with scrawled entries of madness from a former resident named Elijah Green. As she read about mutilated animals, dark rituals, and references to worship, reality began to warp at the edges. A deep-rooted fear clawed its way up her spine, warning her to retreat, to turn back before the darkness swallowed her whole. But Iris was drawn in, her own grief fueling her descent into obsession. As night fully enveloped Eldridge, she came upon the town square, where a forgotten statue of a woman towered over lifeless shrubbery. Her serenity was a stark contrast to the turmoil within Iris. Convinced that she was meant to communicate with the spirits of the Forsaken, Iris placed her palms on the ancient stone, feeling an electrifying chill shoot through her. The ground trembled softly beneath her feet, a viscous hum resounding like a heartbeat, confirming her presence had awoken something that had slumbered for too long. Overhead, the clouds parted, revealing an array of stars, but they seemed wrong. Misaligned and spinning in unnatural patterns, Iris felt glassy, lightheaded, a surreal detachment washing over her. Suddenly she was aware of another presence, a shadow flickering at the edge of her vision, always just out of reach. In icy breath, she could almost taste the decay. It was a bitter metallic tang that filled her mouth. She turned sharply, seeking the source, her pulse racing with adrenaline and terror as her mind fought to maintain coherence. But as she blinked against the dense fog, her surroundings began to shift, the square warping, transforming into a maze of grotesque faces formed from the fog, whispering of dread and ancient pacts. Iris could not escape their accusations. They hurled their discontent and losses upon her as they swirled closer with every frantic breath she took. She pressed forward, her mind unraveling under the weight of their collective anguish, trapped in a labyrinth woven by their sadness. Each cry of despair resonated with the echoes of her own guilt, the loss of her young daughter, things unsaid, bleeding her heart dry. Desperation drove her onward, and in that darkness a sudden clarity emerged. Iris tripped over a stone and fell, sprawling against a cracked hand that seemed to claw at her from the ground. When she turned her gaze, it was not just a hand, it was her daughter, stretching towards her with a skeletal grin, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes echoing oceans of sorrow. Paralyzed by grief, Iris struggled against the tide of emotions crashing around her. The figures melted away, their anguish absorbed into her own soul, and in that moment she understood. She had come not just to mourn, but to make a choice. Clutching her daughter's burned essence, she could see how her own failures had driven them apart, how self-pity could twist love into something horrific. But the fog thickened, breathing a pressure upon her chest that demanded her surrender. Dark realizations clawed at her mind, pulling her deeper into the crevices of Eldridge. The town itself seemed alive, wrapping around her like vines, squeezing the breath from her lungs. The whispers escalated, an orchestra of the damned chanting her name with a fevered rhythm, growing louder as shadows formed tendrils, curling and wrapping around her arms like an embrace. Reality splintered further, until she was not entirely herself, but rather every soul the town had ever claimed. Every misstep spiraling into a pit of madness. With a sudden jolt, Iris burst outward, flinging herself into the embrace of the forest, behind the library, seeking escape. But the trees loomed like sentinels, their twisted bark and gnarled roots intertwining like veins, drawing her deeper into the heart of darkness. The air thickened, cold and unwelcoming, wrapping around her like a shroud as she stumbled forth. And then, with a shocking intensity, she was thrust into a gathering of shadowy figures encircled around an altar, her daughter at its center, the very embodiment of the town's anguish. The truth coiled within Iris like a serpent. She realized she had always been meant to join them, to forsake her mortality, and become a part of this eldritch tapestry. The moment shimmered with clarity as she understood her daughter had never wanted to leave her. It was she who had abandoned them both. In that eternal moment, Iris felt the walls of her sanity compress and fracture, the first threads of her identity slipping away into the ether. She was swallowed whole by the collective despair of Eldridge, becoming an echo, a whisper haunting the dreams of every future traveler who dared trespass into this forsaken town. And as the morning dawned in an eerie beauty, the fog lifted, reclaiming Eldridge once more, leaving only silence and shadows, where before had been an unremarkable graveyard for lost souls and forgotten sins. In the salt-laden air of Port Haven, where the ocean's breath mingled with the tide's whispers, Mara felt the weight of dread settle upon her shoulders like a heavy shroud. Returning to her childhood home after years away, the place haunted by memories of laughter and warmth now resembled a crypt frozen in time. Shadows lingered longer than they should, reaching across the floorboards like gnarled fingers. She had come to fetch the last of her mother's belongings after the funeral, but a gnawing sense of unease filled her, curling around her spine and tightening its grip with each creaking step she took inside the old house. The interior smelled of damp wood and aged books, underpinned by an unsettling sweetness, reminiscent of decaying flowers. As Mara moved cautiously through the familiar hallways, her fingertips brushed against the faded wallpaper, its floral patterns now dull and peeling, revealing the ghostly white underneath. Memories flowed back to her unbidden. Her mother's soft voice, the warmth of sunny afternoons spent in the garden, and the eerie stories she used to tell about the sea. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a graveyard of past joys, echoing only with silence and the occasional scrape of wood against wood. That evening, as twilight draped its purple cloak over the town, Mara decided to sort through her mother's things in the attic, a space she had largely avoided since childhood. The rickety old staircase creaked ominously underfoot. Dust motes danced in the slanting beams of moonlight that broke through the cobwebbed windows, and her skin prickled, sensing something hidden in the shadows. Among the detritus of old family memorabilia, rusting toys, yellowed newspapers, she unearthed a box filled with her mother's diaries. Bound in cracked leather and thick with age, the volumes beckoned her, promising the truths of a woman shed from the light of day. As she flipped through the pages, the inked words began as a jumble of mundane tasks and quiet reflections, but they soon spiraled into darker territory. Her mother's obsession with the sea revealed itself through increasingly frantic entries laden with paranoia and fear. Mara's gaze snagged on phrases like, "The sea speaks," and "They are listening." With each passage, horizons ahead blurred, as though her mother had been drawn into an abyss where the lines between fact and folklore twisted grotesquely. Night fell fully, and shadows seemed to grow longer, feral and alive. In the days that followed, Mara's dreams morphed into unsettling landscapes, the house, the sea, the desperate whispers of the forgotten. Each morning she awoke drenched in sweat, fragments of her mother's words dancing on the edge of her mind. She started hearing the sea's call more vividly, a luring melody that drummed against her chest, pulling at her sanity like a riptide that wouldn't relent. The old town, with its gray, charred buildings once bustling with life, now felt like a faded photo, each person a ghost wearing a forced smile. Isolation gnawed at her, and with every passing hour she edged closer to the precipice of madness. By the third night, a violent storm crashed over Port Haven, rattling windows and drowning out the world in a cacophony of wind and rain. Drawn inexplicably by the tempest, Mara found herself standing outside her home, staring at the churning sea illuminated by flashes of lightning. Waves crashed with a furious intensity, as if the ocean were a beast pleading to be released from its own prison. She felt a pull, a deep yearning to know the place from which her mother had sought company, the very source of her father's whispered warnings. Surrendering to a reckless desire, she waded into the frigid water, feeling it seize her like a predator lunging for its prey. As she swam, cold tendrils wrapped around her limbs. Panic swelled in her chest, but a strange, enticing voice whispered that she must go deeper, that she was meant to return to where the sunken secrets lived. She plunged beneath the waves, the world above dimming into a remote dream, until her body collided with something foreign, rock-hard and ancient. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt a shifting take place, a release of pressure that felt almost like an awakening from sleep. Moving beyond the pain, she opened her eyes to an impossible sight. A submerged city, its architecture twisted and beckoning, covered in layers of greenish muck and swaying tendrils. Time lost all meaning in the depths. Faces lingered in the water, distorted yet familiar. They sang a haunting lullaby of betrayal and loss, voices blending into an echoing rumble that resonated through her very bones. With every pulse of the rhythm, memories she had forgotten surfaced. Memories of her mother's gaze filled with despair, of frantic rituals held beneath a full moon, a cycle never broken. The city's heartbeat synchronized with her own, a constant reminder that she was bound to those who had come before her, trapped in a cyclical nightmare, urging her to join their ranks. Emerging from the depths, Mara clawed her way back to the surface, gasping for air, heart racing, mind shattering. The storm had faded and the town lay in eerie silence, shrouded in a fog thick as molasses. But nothing remained of her mother's house. Only a void, like a ghastly reminder of what she had sought to uncover. Shadows danced on her skin, curling, fingers that caressed skin, and she felt an unsettling warmth, as if the very sea she had sought to escape was now a part of her, throbbing steadily alongside her heartbeat. In a fit of desperate clarity, Mara recalled the journals, their inked prophecies filled with the weight of the ancestors' whispers. A truth swelled within her. She understood now that she was not merely the daughter of a woman, but a vessel of something far older. The tale her mother had spun was not merely fiction, but a binding, a sacrifice offered up to the entities of the sea. And now, standing in the stillness of the town, she felt their cold gaze upon her, demanding her attention. The townsfolk appeared, gathering around her, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. Hollow eyes peered back at her, inscrutable and deep. Layers of dread enveloped her as she realized they never truly left. They had been waiting. The realization dawned upon her that she too was now one with them, the final piece of a tragic assembly resonating from the sea and the shadows. As laughter echoed in the air, tugging at the edges of her sanity and drawing her nearer, the hollow eyes of the lost revealed a terrible truth. There was no escape from the cycle, She would become the next keeper of the forgotten tales, volumes filled with despair waiting to be unearthed again. The horror settled into her bones, thick like the fog that clung to the old town, an inevitable fate woven into her very being. As she reached for the comforting familiarity of the sea that had become both her accomplice and captor, she fell silent, surrendering completely to the tales woven by the hands of darkness. Mara's story blended into the whispers of the forgotten, a haunting refrain that would linger long after her presence faded, and the tides would continue their unforgiving dance, drawing in the next soul lost to the murmur of the waves.